Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. As usual, if you haven't already subscribed, please feel free to do so. I would greatly appreciate it. And also, if you have any comments and or suggestions about what you would like to see next, feel free to let me know down in the comments section down below. Okay, so let's get started. So for today's video, I want to go back into Salesforce land and talk about the Apex batch. Now, some background information on that. An Apex batch, it's really useful when you're trying to process a lot of records that would normally lead to some type of processing limit, essentially going over the governor limits that are set forth in Salesforce. Some good things to know about the Apex batch, or I guess important things to know, are that the process itself, it's asynchronous, which means that it will run whenever Salesforce thinks it has enough resources to get the job done. As well, some, I guess, vocabulary about the Apex batch is creating an Apex batch itself is essentially just creating an Apex class, and you can instantiate that class, which we'll go over in a bit. But each time the code in that class is run, that's referred to as a transaction. And the cool thing about Apex batches is that you can specify how many of those transactions you want to run. So as an example, let's say you had 1,000 records, and you know that you're going to hit governor limits after you try to process 10 records because maybe there's a lot of callouts or your SQL queries are too big and they can't contain, it would return too much information all at once. So you can specify towards this Apex batch that you want to do a transaction of only 9 records at a time until it's done processing all the records that you give it. And another thing as well is if one transaction fails, it doesn't roll over the other batches that might have succeeded beforehand. So it's just some things to keep in mind. Now, jumping into our Salesforce org that we have in Trailhead, the scenario, or I guess the requirement that I want to kind of pose so that we can kind of build this out together is imagine that the sales support team needs the ability to change a supply records status, so this field right here, to out of stock if the quantity is set to 0. Now, they could do this manually very easily, but let's imagine, just for the sake of this scenario, that there are thousands of supply records and they can't really dedicate time to do this manually. And also they probably wouldn't want to do that because that's kind of a waste of time if we're being honest. So they've asked us to come up with some more automated way of doing so. And one of the takeaways from this requirement is if you hear the words or something along the lines of like, oh, we want to process a lot of records all at once, and by a lot we mean maybe like 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 or how many records it is, but as long as it's a lot of records, that might be a good use case for the Apex batch. Okay, so with that scenario in our head, let's go ahead and start working on the code itself. Let's jump into our developer console, and as you can see here, I've already gone ahead and created an Apex class. In this case, I just called it supply quantity check batch. I'm not too sure about the naming convention itself. I've seen it many different ways. The one I like to use is I just like to add batch to the end of my class to kind of denote that to other developers or administrators. But essentially the first thing we need to do is we need to implement the database.batchable interface, which we can do so by writing database.batchable. And then here we have to specify S object, because essentially we're going to be operating on some type of record. Okay. When we implement this interface, you'll see here, if I move this up, that it's complaining and it looks like gibberish, and that is because it's implements, not implement. So if we do that and we try to save now, we should get a different set of errors here. And now it's basically saying that we have to implement these different methods. And that's because that is a requirement of this interface right here. So to kind of explain that, the database batchable interface requires us to implement 3 different methods. It's the start, the execute, and the finish method. To kind of explain this very quickly, the start method is used to kind of specify to our batch which records it needs to operate on, and the execute method is used to actually do some processing to those records. Now, something important to note, like I mentioned earlier, we can specify to this batch class how many records it should process at once. So essentially, think of this example that in this start method right here, we're going to tell this batch class that we want to process 1,000 records and that we want to process them in batches of 10 or 10 records for each transaction. This execute method is essentially going to run 10 records at a time until it's gone through all 1,000 records. And lastly, once it's done executing all the records, this method will fire once. And I guess just to add a bit more information to that, this method right here, the finish method, could be useful for many different things. But one of the, I guess, common ones that I can think of at the top of my head is that you can use this to kind of notify someone that this batch is done running via an email or some other type of alert. Okay, so let's go ahead and start implementing these. To begin with, let's go ahead and implement the start method. And this one in particular, it's kind of interesting because the return type of this can be one or two different things. And what I mean by that is that it can either return a database.query locator. I believe that's the correct term right there. So let's go ahead and just do that for a bit, and then I'll show you guys the other one. So we'll say this method is called start because that's the requirement, and we are going to expect in the database.batchable context as so. And let's go ahead and open this up. So as I said, this method is kind of interesting because we can expect to return either a database.query locator object, and this query locator is just an object that contains a reference to a SQL query that will return from this method. The other thing that we can return instead is an iterable, and I think most of the time, without getting too into it, because this is just kind of an intro video that I'll kind of be expanding on in the future, but the iterable, which can be shown by writing iterable and then writing s object like this, basically means it's going to return some iterable s object. This is really useful if you need to like pre-process your records before sending it to the execute method. And like I said, I'll make another video in the future that kind of goes into more depth. But for now, let's just go ahead and use the database.query locator, and we'll kind of demonstrate how that works. So like I said, this database.query locator is essentially an object that holds a reference to a SQL query. And what I mean by that is, let's go ahead and I guess just kind of show that real quick. So we're going to say we're going to return a database query locator object, and inside of here we have two options. We can return a string, which can be a SQL statement here, or I believe as of more recent versions of Salesforce Apex, you can return inline an actual SQL statement here that returns a list itself. And I'll go ahead and return this list version instead. I kind of like the fact that, well, this IDE, although it's kind of limited in what it can do for us, it will kind of complain at us if we misspell something. So let's go ahead and say we want to return a list of IDs. We also want to return get the status rather. And we want the quantity as well. And I guess just for fun, let's also get the name of the supply. And actually, I believe name is a standard field, so it's just name. And we're going to go ahead and grab that from the supply object, like so. And per our requirements, we need to get the records where the quantity is equal to 0. So we can do that. And like I said, essentially, this is going to return an object that contains a reference to this SQL query right here. Now, automatically, when this Apex class gets called, it's going to run this start method right here, and it's going to return this. And essentially, this is going to then go ahead and start calling the execute method for every single batch. So now let's go ahead and create the execute method. The execute method is a bit simpler in that it doesn't return anything. It simply just gets called and it does some kind of work. In here, we have two parameters. There is the database.batchable context method, and the list of records themselves that are going to be passed in from the start method. So here we're going to expect to receive a list of supplies. And I'll just go ahead and call this supply list. Okay, so now in here is where we want to do our actual work. And like I said before, the requirement that we received was essentially if the quantity is equal to 0, then we want to set the supply status to inactive. Okay, so let's go ahead and start doing that. As always, I like to be a little bit more defensive, so I'm going to say if the supply list that we received in, if that actually contains something, then we're going to go ahead and do something. Okay, so if it exists, then let's go ahead and process those records. And we will do so by doing a for loop. So we're going to say, let's get our instance of the supply. We'll call this supply. And then we're going to iterate through the supply list. And here, because this query that we received only contains supply records where the quantity equals 0, I'm not going to check that. I'm just going to make the assumption that this SOQL query is working as intended. So all we need to do now is simply just change the status to inactive. Okay, and I think that pretty much does it. To kind of finish this off, let's go ahead and create the finish method, and like the execute method, there is no return type to it, but it does expect to receive this database.batchable context. And without getting too into the weeds of it, what this batchable context is this parameter contains two methods, one that allows you to get the job ID of this job itself. It's not really useful for us now. So like I said, I'm going to just kind of gloss over it for now. So anyways, like I said here, this finish method is very useful for doing things such as alerting to the fact that it's been done, or if we wanted to do some further processing of these records now that this is done. For now, all I'm going to do is just do a simple debug to our console, which I'll do so by saying here, finished right there. That way we can just see here that once we run this batch itself, that it's been done. Okay, so let me go ahead and click save. And we can see here that we have an error, method does not exist or incorrect signature. The problem is that I messed up writing this. The name of this method is actually getQueryLocator, not queryLocator. So like that. Now if we go ahead and save, this error message goes away. Okay, so we've now written a very simple batch class. And like I said, I'm going to make a few more videos in the future as well. Some of the ones that I can think of that I want to do are how to do callouts in a batch, or how to keep state across the different transactions of this batch. But that'll be another video. Okay, so to execute this method right here, or this class right here, for now, let's use our anonymous window right here. And all we need to do is just instantiate this class right here. And we can do so by, I'm going to go ahead and copy this right here because I'm too lazy to write everything out. But essentially, we're going to say supply quantity check batch. And then let's give this object a name of batch. And then we'll just instantiate it like so. And to actually execute this batch instance that we've created, we just need to call the database.executeBatch method and pass in this batch instance. So let's go ahead and do that. Database.executeBatch. And we are just going to pass in this batch. This method actually returns an ID, and that's just kind of to keep track of the batch ID that was assigned to by Salesforce. And I guess we'll just kind of get it and we'll just kind of log it out. Okay, so ID, batch ID right there. And like I mentioned before, we can actually control how many records are processed at a time by this execute method. And to do so, we can make use of this secondary optional parameter. If you don't provide it, I believe that by default, it'll process 200 records at a time. That's something you might want to check with the documentation though. But like I said, if If your execution right here involves something that's very complex and that will run up CPU time and will cause some CPU exceptions, or also if you're going to be doing a SOCL query that just retrieves too many records, that again leads to hitting those governor limits, then specifying a smaller batch size will probably do it for you. For now, let's go ahead and say we just want to process in batches of 10. So again, the way it's going to work is when this is instantiated and this runs, it's going to call this method once to get all those records. And one thing about this right here, when you use this getQueryLocator method, it's actually bypassing the governor limits a little bit. I believe when you do it this way, you can actually retrieve up to, I believe it actually allows you to retrieve like 20 million or 50 million records at once. So that's kind of a cool thing right there. But anyways, so it'll retrieve the records that you want to work on. And then this method will be called with 10 records right here. It'll execute. And then again, it'll get called once again with 10 records, and it'll just keep basically iterating through like as if it was a for loop until it's done processing those records in batches of 10. Okay, so once we have that, oh, and yeah, once that's done, then finally the finish method gets called. To kind of demonstrate that, let's go ahead and just execute it very quickly. So you'll see here, we have this loading pane. Once that's done, let's go ahead and look at our logs. And if we look at our logs right here, you'll see these chunk handlers. This is essentially each transaction that has happened. So like think of the batch of 10. It happened a few times right here. And I believe if we click into one of these, it might be this one right here. Let's go ahead and hit debug only. You'll see here that we have this output that just says finished. And that's essentially just the finish method right here that got called. And all we did was just debug the finished. One other thing I kind of want to point out, if we go back to our org and let's go into the setup right here, we can search for jobs and we'll have this option for Apex jobs. If we click on that, we get this error message because I guess it wants us to see it in classic. That's fine. But you'll see here that I've recently created a job, and the job tab is batch Apex, and here it processed a total of 1 batch. I guess because we didn't have many records to begin with, but that's fine. So you can use this interface here to kind of see which batch is running at a given time. And now that it says completed, let's go ahead and look at our actual records themselves. I'll go ahead and just refresh this list view here. And we can see here that we have a few records that have 0 quantity, but nothing actually happened. So let's go ahead and jump back into our console, and you'll very quickly see that I made a small error. Our logic itself is fine, but I actually forgot to update this record list, which kind of goes to show you that even someone that's worked with Salesforce for a bit or done some bit of programming can still make a lot of mistakes. So let's go ahead and update our actual supply list like this. Okay, so now once it's done processing our records, it'll go ahead and update our records. So let's go ahead and click on save. And once more, we'll execute this right here. Once that's done running, let's go back into our Apex jobs right here. I'll click refresh, and we can see here that this batch just finished running. And now if we go into our list view and we click refresh, we now see here that we have all these inactive supplies. So essentially for all these that have quantity 0, the status is now inactive, which kind of shows that this actually did work. Okay, so that in a nutshell is kind of how the Apex batch works. Now there are some other things to consider. As an example, like now that we have this code, you could kind of give this to the sales support people, but it's code and you might not want to give them that control because they could mess something up. So in terms of like presenting this as a deliverable to the sales support team, you could do a few different things. You could basically create a Visualforce page with a button that then calls this and then deliver that to them and then just have them click the button whenever they need to process their records. You can create a lightning component that's also displayed somewhere on their dashboard. You could create a list view JavaScript button, but that only works in Classic. But what I want to kind of propose is, what if they added an extra requirement, and that's that they want to automate this process. Essentially, like what if they said, okay, we want this process to run, at the end of the day on every Friday of the week. Well, one thing you could do is you could just kind of remember, set an alarm and remind you to run this code before you leave at the end of your workday on a Friday. Or you can make use of what's called a schedulable, and essentially you can schedule this to run automatically every single Friday at the end of the day. And I think that will be another video as well that I'll make in the future. But just kind of throwing ideas out there that it's possible to further automate this process. Okay, so I hope my ramblings kind of made sense to you guys. I think I'll cut it here. And like I said, I'll make more videos in the future. But yeah, I think that's pretty much going to do it for me. I hope you guys learned something, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.